But all right, it's time to start the webinar. So welcome to everybody who is here, and for those who are joining us later or online, welcome to the last MyData webinar in 2019. Yeah, though definitely it's not the last webinar in general. We aim to continue sharing relevant know-how and practical use cases, as well as theoretical input on what does it take to make human-centric personal data happen. My name is Sille Sepp, and I serve as the community lead for MyData Global, and I will moderate today's webinar, which will focus then on some of the mechanisms how to make consent work in today's realm of data sharing. And we're happy to have Jim Pasquale from Cantera Initiative sharing light on the very much acclaimed global consent receipt specification, which aims to decrease the reliance on privacy policies and enhance the ability for people to share and control personal information. Jim's talk is then complemented with a presentation by Ahlin from Datafund, who will be talking about their take on Kantara's consent received by using open source consent received suite and storing them into FairDrop decentralized storage. Before heading into our today's exciting presentations, I'd like to also start with a few words about MyData in general. For those who are attending today the webinar for the first time or listening the webinar later on, for the first time. So MyData is an idea. It's also an alternative vision for an ethical use of personal data. It's a movement and a large community. It's a global organization. The community, the movement, and the organization is coming together around the core idea of MyData that people, you and I, should have an easy way to see how where data about us goes, specify who can use it, and alter these decisions over time. And we believe that to see this vision become a reality in the world, we need to push for three big shifts. First of them being moving from formal to actionable rights, to have really practical good means to exercise the rights that different regulations put forward. Also move from the mindset of protecting data as such to more empowering individuals to enable the data use for their own benefits. As well as then the third shift, moving from closed to open ecosystems. These shifts, together with the 6 principles, are further explained in the MyData Declaration that you find in our website, and it's also translated into 10 languages already. The MyData movement and community is facilitated by MyData Global organization, whose main purpose is to empower individuals by improving their right to self-determination regarding their personal data. And we're doing this together with the different stakeholders from all across business, legal, technical, and societal sectors that make up together the MyData community. And as I mentioned earlier, these webinars are then the space and time where to learn about the work related to human-centric personal data management. Few words also about the practicalities. The flow of the webinar would go like this, that both Jim and Gert take approximately 15 to 20 minutes for each of their presentations. And then we can take a few questions after each talk. And follow up with a short discussion in the end to talk more about the generally about today's topic. Before I go ahead and give the word to our presenters, I want to also let you know that today's webinar is being recorded, so we can share this with others who are unavailable to attend today. So if you wouldn't like to voice out your comments or questions yourself during the question round or in the discussion, then I encourage you to make use of the Zoom chat. during the call. Leave your comments there, your questions, and I can take them up in the discussion, voice them out myself. All right, I think I've said everything that I wanted to share, and I'll pass the ball then to Jim, who will also share his screen for slides.
Okay, well, welcome everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. Just give me a moment while I bring up the presentation. I have quite a few slides that I'm going to go through quickly. I will convert this presentation to a PDF and make sure the folks at MyData have it if you would like to see it. The Cantera Initiative, as you all well know, is in its going in its 11th year of operation, and we are an organization that allows individuals and companies to participate in building specifications that are certified by the initiative and then freely distributed across the globe to interested parties that look to implement it. So here are a few of the folks that are working in and around a consent receipt, and what really is consent and an agreement, but more of an artifact that one has to be able to take action against a previous event that took place. We're also working on a privacy control panel. There are a group of products that you'll see showing an actual receipt and a little bit of information around the work group itself. So the goal, of course, is to create a highly available, interoperable standard that allows an artifact to be created, a receipt to be created that people can use and reuse as their needs. So what is this artifact? What is this receipt? It really is a capture of, in today's world, when you go to a store, when you purchase something, you usually get a receipt, and the key point is it captures a transaction, but there's no personal data involved. And for those individuals that are on the call this morning that have a little bit of background in telecommunications or data communications, it's much like the call data record that most carriers generate. And the key point here is that really there's no personal data that's involved yet. However, it captures some very poignant information that sets the policies in place to understand what a relationship is. So let's take a moment to see how these different companies like Datafund and Consentua and Ubiscure and even DigiMe have taken the consent receipt specification in its agreement flow. So in the very beginning, when you think about how a requester and a responder of requirement for wanting data flows through, and that is a service provider makes a service available and an individual discovers that service. There is some very basic germane information that is passed once the individual has discovered the service and looked at the terms, reviewed the terms, and either accepted or not accepted what those terms are. If they accept it, they now have an established agreement. Again, and there's really no personal information that is required or is necessary to flow between the two entities at this point. Now, we then start to look at, well, once those terms are accepted and once an agreement is reached, there's a point where record keeping is required. Today, most of that record keeping is done on the service provider side, you know, in a CRM system, in large databases of sales receipts in the brick and mortar world. But the key point here is that a record is created, just like a call data record is created with what number was called, when it was picked up, the duration of the call, and things of that nature. But again, there's really no personal data that has kind of transpired back and forth. But in the end, once that record has been generated and the considerations have been agreed to, the transaction is finished and it ends. And when it does end, there is now a new point where that receipt is actually generated. And again, there's doesn't have to be personal data involved yet. Once that agreement or the end of that agreement, I don't want to use the word terminated, but the end of that agreement is reached, that record is then shared back to the individual. Just as if you go to the store, once your payment is completed, whether you used cash or whether you used a credit card, you get a receipt. So the importance, of course, is these key points. It's the record keeping, it's the exception of the terms, and it's the ability then to share that information, which traditionally in the digital world, even when you go to a website, that doesn't necessarily always happen. So why not create this personal data receipt based on this notion of consent and agreement or authorization between two or more entities that have agreed on terms and have agreed to create a relationship. So when the personal data is involved, we really start to look into the privacy notice, the statement, what is the purpose, general information around the controller so that the data subject has some kind of agency to contact who that data controller is. And I'm sure the folks that are on this call today clearly understand where much of these terms come from, or the GDPR. So it's that record keeping now, and you can see the different components of where the privacy statement and the notice now are in the hands of the data subject who has rights. And it's that record keeping piece that allows the consent receipt to capture all of that information. So you are no longer bound to have to contact, as a data subject, a company's DPO, privacy officer, to try and understand where the data has been shared, who's it been shared with, when it's been shared with, things of that nature. The consent receipt moves in that general direction. And what's interesting, what's been happening, and a cause of that is now these kinds of transactions are being placed on a blockchain as an immutable event. And that's a memorialization of information that has been agreed to move actually moving. And so while you may not see that information on a blockchain, you now have a secure, safe, manageable way to go back and prove that that transaction hadn't been tampered with, hasn't changed, and the agreements once put in place continue to be put in place. So the whole idea of a personal data receipt that uses consent is evidence of the event. Evidence of the event to the point where it can be placed on a blockchain and actually be used. Suddenly I'm one slide behind in the video sharing here. Let's see. I certainly am. Okay, so let me close this for a moment so that I'm now seeing the same slide that is on your screen, but not on my screen. So what I was just referring to is the standardization of this personal data receipt that goes beyond just a requesting party for information or having information to have to now the individual. And that creates, of course, two different things. That creates agency and providency on behalf of the individual. So let's quickly look through and go through the specification itself. You can find it on the Kantara website. It's open source, so you can download it and write to the specification. You can see who some of the contributors are and have been for the specification itself. Here's a quick look at some of the JSON and some of the information that you actually see in machine readable language. And here it should be human readable. So these are the fields and the definitions and what you start to see in a consent receipt in human readable terms. Here are several companies that have actually taken the consent receipt and put it into their authorization process or their permissioning process that creates this receipt at the end. And what's important to recognize here is that these companies that have implemented this now can share with individuals the actual information inside the receipt, and importing and exporting of those receipts in and out of a system then starts to create the whole idea of this personal data receipt and a record. We think of it inside the Cantera Initiative in and around the whole idea of a shoebox. So imagine that over a period of time, you suddenly have all of these personal data receipts of all of your actions on the website and with other apps that are asking for personal data or asking for information for that matter, whether it's PII or not. And your ability now to go back and sit and look to see exactly what you shared, when you shared it, and with whom. And this becomes important when you think about breaches. So, you know, we live in this fast track world, and you get a notice of company XYZ having a breach, and you recognize the name of the company. You should be able to go back into that quote unquote shoebox, that database of those consent receipts that are in a standard format, and be able to look at it to be able to take action. So these are the things that we're working on. And the consent information sharing work group has a partner work group called Consent Management Solutions. But the key is to continue to drive innovation, experimentation, and the ability to broaden an individual's ownership and capabilities of controlling that data within information sharing. So now again, this is pretty odd. Okay, so this particular slide, there it is. Okay, so this particular slide is a rendition and an example of what that dashboard might look like. And I will quickly go through a simple demo. We have an individual on a computer. They found something from a service provider, and of course, none of these are working. Oh, here they come. Oh, now it's store, view. One more, come on. There you go. So this would actually be the flow. That's one of the downsides of Zoom that I've always found, is that it often has a significant delay, especially on mobile devices. And that ends the Kantara consent receipt presentation. I'm very happy to introduce one of our partners, Datafund, who will actually go through a demo and give a better and more detailed explanation of the actual flows, and then we will be answering questions. So hopefully I've given you a wider, broader view around consent, permission, and authorization, and how it is applicable to a personal data receipt. Thank you very much. Appreciate your time. I'll turn the time back over to the moderator now.
Thank you, Jim. And thank you very much for this very good introduction on the understanding what is the what are consent receipts and how the Kantara is tackling this. It looks really amazing. I see already in the Zoom chat that there are a couple of questions.
So the first question from Juan is, do we insert the consent receipt in a blockchain? And the answer to that is no, we would not, only based on the fact that it is a specification to be used and not necessarily a product. Did that answer the question?
Yes, thank you. This answered my question.
Jim, yeah, thank you for your talk. So in Korea, the Korea Data Agency actually made the consent receipt one of the 6 major pillars that selected or projects selected for government funding that they need to implement. And I think the slides that you showed, it'd be really, really helpful to the Korea Data Agency and our hub members in general. So yeah, I don't know if you're able to, but if you could share the slides, that'd be really great.
Oh yeah, yes, I will. As I mentioned in the first slide of the presentation, I will export these to a PDF file and get them to the MyData folks to distribute to anyone who's interested. And since they're in a PDF format, and this is all open source information anyway, not only can they see the slides, but they could probably listen to this event recording today at their leisure.
Great, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments that you'd like to share from the other participants of the webinar?
Actually, I have one more question. So I may have missed this if you talked about it in the beginning of the talk, but it said that the consent receipt specification it was accepted into the ISO TS something. What does that exactly mean? And does that mean it's been accepted as a standard?
So thank you for your question, Chris. That is an important observation. So where we are with ISO at this point is we are now apexed into one of their personal information sharing standard groups where in sum and substance, the concept of consent receipt and the consent receipt itself now are accepted as a usable resource.
So just to make sure I understand this clearly, so it's not yet accepted as a standard, but it's considered stable enough to be used in production.
Correct.
Okay, cool, great, thank you.
Very good. All right, I would then close the round right now, and if you have any further comments or questions, then hold this to the end of the webinar, and give the floor now to Chert for the presentation on their take on the consent receipt. Chert, go ahead and share your slides as well.
Thank you, Celia. I hope you can hear me and see my screen.
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you. So I'm Chert Ahlin from Datafund. I will present actually two of our products, but mostly the consent receipt suite, as we call it, but also the FairDrop app in the context of consent receipts. So the public that might be interested most in this is, I guess, if you are an app developer or if you are a privacy conscious individual. I will present the consent receipt suite. So this is a set of modules, open source modules that you can use to work with consents. Then I will show quickly FairDrop decentralized storage that can be used to store these receipts. And I will, in this way, demonstrate the idea of the benefits of storing consents in one place, basically. About the consent receipt suite, this is a set of modules, programs that is open sourced, programmed in the React framework that should allow for easy integration into other products. And we designed it so that it is modular. You have like parts that can be used to generate or view the Kantara consent receipt. And then we have parts that can be used for decentralized, pardon me, decentralized signing and storage of consent receipts. Like to be used in the relationship, to establish a relationship between two parties. What I will show you now is a demo app that merges all these modules of the consent receipt suite into one app. This app is not meant to be used like per se in production. It's just for demonstration purposes. In real life, you would like plug in these modules into your applications where they are needed and not have them like in one place like here. So now I will change the tabs, and in front of me is this demo app I was talking about. Let me also mention that this app runs completely in JavaScript, so it can be also run as a decentralized app. Currently, I'm running it from a folder on my computer. The app has basically three tabs. The first one is called Editor. This editor is about generating and viewing Kantara compliant consent receipts. And then the other two tabs, Send and Sign and Received Receipts, will showcase the blockchain functionalities we have built. So let me show you the Kantara part. So the Editor tab. Up here is what we call, we can upload here what we call a project configuration file. I will upload one that is already prepared. And this file contains three parts. It's made of three parts. The first part is a JSON schema. This defines what are the required structure of the consent receipt. And in here is basically a copy paste of the Kantara specified consent receipt version 1.1. When a new JSON specification is issued by Kantara, the idea is that you could put the new version in here and it should work out of the box. The second part is the UI schema. So the UI schema is also in JSON, and it defines how this editor window will be shown. So this editor window in principle should be like visible maybe to an administrator in a corporation that is deciding what will be in the consent receipt issued to the individual. And the UI schema defines how these components will look like. So something could be like a menu, something could be a text box. So for instance, here you have a menu with options. All this is defined in the UI schema. The third part is the actual data that is entered into this form. So this is the part that becomes later the consent receipt when it is signed. And you can see here that, that whatever I enter here is immediately updated in the form data part. Also, I will mention that for convenience, here you have also the a JSON editor part where you can like edit the names of these fields and so on. So now let's say we have the contents of the consent receipt as we want it, then we need to encode it. So I will copy paste from another window an RSA private key in here. So to encode, to sign the consent receipt and encode it as a JSON web token. This is the token. It doesn't tell you much by looking at it. So you can verify that it was signed correctly, and then you can also decode it. These are all parts of the modules. So here is a JSON, decoded JSON showing what is in the consent receipt. And so this is the editor window, and we also have a viewer window. This is rendering a human readable form of the consent receipt. It's not very pretty, but it's meant to be modified as your organization needs it, so you can change the styling and use a more nicely looking human readable form. Okay, so now I will move to demonstrate the blockchain parts. I will go to the Send and Sign tab, and this is where I already have a wallet, so the private key is imported into the browser. So I will just now unlock the account for controller 111. This is in the back. I'm unlocking an Ethereum wallet, an Ethereum private key. And these are already the consents that this controller has worked with here in the table. So I have done some demo work previously. I will upload a project configuration file that I generated in the previous tab. So I have one ready. I will then encode it with the RSA private key. And then I will send this encoded receipt to the principal 111. Now what I will do, so these names, these are actually names in the FairDrop app that I will show later. This FairDrop app allows you to access your Swarm decentralized storage. You will see it later, and it will be more clear what this is about. So both the principal and controller should first open these accounts in the FairDrop app for this to be possible. You can also do this, so open accounts here if you do wallet, like create wallet, but I didn't go through this now for the demo. So I will now I will sign this consent receipt and send it to the principal 111 party. So clicking this and waiting a bit. So this signs the transaction, puts it on the blockchain, and saves the consent receipt to decentralized storage. So the consent receipt is not on the blockchain, but on Swarm decentralized storage. You can see here that sorry, maybe the ordering is not correct, but if I now move to, so you can see here the status of these consent receipts. And if I move now to the tab received receipts and log in as the principal 111, unlocking the account, there's some info about the balance of tokens on this account and the QR code for the public address of the account. And I can here see waiting for me a consent receipt, so sent from controller 111. Signed on the blockchain, but I haven't signed it yet. So I will now open it and look at it. And for instance, I see it's okay. I will give my consent and sign it. So waiting a bit, refreshing this should show me that I have signed this. So it's active. The consent receipt is active. And so this is basically the flow. So you can use this blockchain functionalities or not, depending on which modules you use in your application. So what you generate here in the editor, you can just generate a consent receipt and sign it via email or however. But we see this as the future of how things should be done. So storing the consent receipts in decentralized storage and ensuring the identities of the data controller and the data principal with these signatures on the blockchain. And okay, I have shown you the consent receipt suite now. There are also some videos of recordings of what I have just done on YouTube, if you want to look at them later. And now let me move to FairDrop. FairDrop is an app running also entirely in JavaScript. It uses Swarm decentralized storage in the back, so it connects to Swarm for storage. You can access it with an Ethereum private key. And FairDrop, we have plans to change FairDrop into FairDrive, a more general application. FairDrop is currently, with FairDrop you can currently send someone files. It's like a file exchange app, but we see it growing into a general personal data storage application where you will have all sorts of data, application data, maybe data exported from other apps and things like that. And FairDrive, so both FairDrop and FairDrive will be open sourced and maintained by the Fair Data Society. So there's a video example of this, but I will show it now live to you. So this is the FairDrop app. So it has, these are the folders, so like folders of received, sent, and stored files in the FairDrop app. And it has a special folder called consents. And the consents that we generated previously and sent to this principal 111 are now seen in this folder consents. So you can see that at 2:38 today, so this is my local time 4 minutes ago, there is a JSON Web Token file saved here. So this is the one that we sent to this person, and we can download it here and put it somewhere else. The idea is that this folder, that additional functionality can be built on top of this folder. So here, currently you can just download it, but you could also have like buttons here to revoke consent or to exercise other GDPR rights or whatever you can think of, and access to this folder. So this is decentralized storage. We as Datafund actually don't have access to this, only the person in control of his account has, but he can share this to anyone willing to offer services to him or needing this kind of information. So anyone could build an app on top of this doing advanced functions like Jim said, maybe a privacy control panel. So we see this FairDrive as a good solution to be a shoebox for consents, to have consent sheets all stored in a single place. And another thing that's nice about decentralized storage is that there's just a single version of this consent receipt that is actually accessible by both the data controller and the data principal. So if the data controller opened his FairDrop account, he would also see the same consent receipt in his consents folder. So we have like a single source of truth for the consents. To wrap things up, Swarm storage, decentralized storage, offers us a provable single source of truth for the consent receipts. As Datafund, we want to build up an EU GDPR resource pool of Swarm storage, so to be fully compliant with GDPR regulations in Europe. We'll build a network of nodes offering this kind of storage. And my call to action to you listening to this is to try out the CRS, so this is the consent receipt suite for consent management. Give us feedback, and also try out FairDrop as an option for personal data storage and for storing consent receipts. I guess I will also share this slide later after I equip it with proper logos, otherwise my marketing director will not be happy with me. And you can look at things we have on GitHub and the blogs we have written about the consent receipt suite, Swarm, FairDrop, and the Fair Data Society. I would like to thank you for your attention, and if you have any further questions, please we can address them now. Thank you.
Thank you, Kurt. It was really interesting to see the actual demo of the FairDrop. I've heard about it before, but never got the chance to look into that before. Before asking my questions, I'd give the floor first to our participants of the webinar. What are your questions or comments to Kurt and their work on the FairDrop? No questions at this point, or people having trouble unmuting themselves. Well, I was wondering myself you started your presentation also that this is interesting to app developers as well as for the privacy concerned individuals. So can you share like how much even like are individuals using FairDrop at this point, and a little bit also the question of like what type of or what level of data literacy one even needs to have in order to make sense of the consent receipt, the FairDrop, and then to start managing this. So first question of like more practical, how's it for you today, and then more on a level of like what is required even.
Well, about the number of users who's using FairDrop, we actually don't know the exact number because we have designed this thing so that we do not know when somebody is using the app. So it's totally private. We have been using it internally, and we are working on ways to, we believe there is some room for improvement regarding the usability for this kind of apps. So the largest problem with using apps based on private keys is the private key management. So currently you have to manage your private keys yourself. If you lose them, you lose access to this storage. And so a solution has to be developed to enable the mainstream user to be able to use the account as he's used to, maybe forgetting a password, definitely not losing his private key. So this is, so FairDrop is still, I would call it, currently it is in alpha. We will soon issue a pro version of FairDrop, where in this month actually, where we will offer file persistence, so-called pinning. This is so Swarm decentralized storage by default, files are periodically like garbage collected, unless you have this functionality of pinning, where you will be able to pay for a file to be available indefinitely. So this is something that we will release this month. And so the other question was about consent receipts, if I remember correctly. So if people understand these consent receipts, I guess here there's also a lot of work left to make the human readable consent receipt more user-friendly. It should probably just show some of the fields that are in the Kantara compliant consent receipt, and it should maybe even depend on what a person wishes to see. So this is like a room to personalize the way how the consent receipt should look, and it's a whole other field of work, I guess. But if you can get all the consent receipts to flow into one folder, to have the person really in control of what data he has agreed to be used, he has given away, then we are a step further to managing the consents as they should be. And it would also make sense to build like a really user-friendly interface on top of this consents folder to show him in an understandable way what he has agreed to or what he is about to agree to. Did I answer your questions?
Yes, thank you. I see a raised hand also from Chris. So go ahead, Chris.
Hi, thank you for your talk. Just to make sure I understood this correctly. So the CRS is a consent receipt suite, which managed the consent part. And the actual file sending was done through FairDrop. And FairDrop seems to be set up so that it is able to keep a record or receive the consent receipt record from the CRS. And so I guess my question would be, if I were to use, say, another sort of a file sharing service or another PDS, in that case, what would need to be done in order to also be able to collect the consent receipts from the CRS that you've created?
Yeah, so basically this suite is meant as a suite of modules. So this is a demo app of this suite. And you could generate the consent receipt with what is on the editor tab. And then you could manipulate it as you wish, like sending it to your PDS or whatever you wish to do with it. But if it is already in FairDrive, we have libraries that you can use to access the FairDrive storage and take the receipt from there, of course, if you have the proper keys and access to this. Maybe, I don't know if I answered you in enough detail. Maybe Gregor could elaborate on this process a bit more technically.
All right. So as Chris, you said it right. So the CRS, the consent receipts suite, is about how to create the consent, how to manage it, and we use FairDrop. FairDrop is a separate app that basically is using it's an example of how this consent suite can be used. Now, as FairDrop is completely open, it's also it can be used by anybody else. It can be forked. It can use the same ways, the same libraries as the library that we have, FVS.js, to basically develop own solutions that use the consent receipt suite and that use the same underlying storage the user has. Now, I think there was one other question, but in all this shuffle, I forgot it. Could you maybe repeat the other question?
Okay, sure. So the other question was, so if I were to want to connect the CRS or the consent receipt that I designed through the CRS to my PDS, say for instance Personium, then what would be the type of challenges that I should expect to face, and then yeah, I mean, yeah, and actually I have another question too.
So for okay, so for Personium, I don't know exactly the architecture, and but in general, you know, these libraries are written in JavaScript. So basically, at the points within your solution where you either need to generate or view the consent, you use the appropriate parts. It should be, we want to design and release our things so that we make life of other developers easy, not more difficult. So I don't think there would be any particular challenges. Now, in the case of, as Personium is also a personal data store, so basically we are now using here FairDrop as personal data store. I'd say it's more from the end user's perspective, it's more the challenges that we all face is how to ensure proper interoperability, and that the user, you know, if the user uses different solutions, that they still have a centralized view of, in this case, consent receipts. So, but in general, in terms of using the consent receipts suite, there shouldn't be any challenges. Did this answer your question?
Actually, yes, that's a perfect answer.
Yes.
Thank you.
We also know the Personium guys, so we're good friends, and this is actually the interoperability between FairDrive and Personium is on our roadmap sometime in the future.
It sounds great, because the Korea Hub actually implemented a Personium server. So I think maybe we could be one of your first people to try it out.
So for this, it would then actually, you know, there's like more ways how to tackle this. Maybe we can even set up a call also with the guys from Personium, from the Korea Hub, people from Korea Hub and us, and we coordinate what would be maybe the best way to approach it. Because yes, it's actually a small world, yeah.
Great to see already a very active bridge building and work towards taking steps forward for interoperability between the different regions as well.
Yes, and nowadays, if I may just add, sorry, Sile, I would say also the consent receipt suite might be very interesting for Korea, because Korea and also our other solutions, because Korea is also very strong in the blockchain and decentralized space. So these solutions, because we also see ourselves as blockchain first organization, so the solutions that we develop are actually made and designed in the with the goal that they are suitable for other decentralized projects. So for example, when we have like blockchain projects, all the blockchain projects in essence also need storage. This is why Ethereum started with the World Computer Vision, but it's something of a neglected area currently in this space. So with all this, it could be actually really good also to connect through these solutions the wider Korean blockchain ecosystem with the MyData movement. I think this would be very interesting. I think, to do.
Yeah, I agree. We'll talk more.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Due to the press time that we have for this webinar, I would move to more general discussion and also invite Jim back to speak. And more generally, like not specifically about each of the solutions that were presented today, but more on the kind of dynamics around consent, the issues around consent, and general questions what you've had around this topic. Is there anything that comes to your mind or that you'd like to share at this point from the audience?
Nope, I would just like to thank everyone again and offer them the opportunity to go to the Kantara website, look at the different work groups, look at the kinds of innovation that we're working on, and find something interesting and join.
Yeah, definitely. And just thank you for both of you as well for doing this work, because as you mentioned, like there's a lot to build on top of the existing framework, and then to even further develop this kind of solutions around consent management and empower the individual even more. Something that did come to my mind, though, was that like Jim was mentioning, that there will be the consent receipts would be only accumulating. There would be tons of different consents to kind of manage as such, and there's constantly it's an increasing need to give consents or decide not to give consents to different requests. So what are your views on how to make the whole issue in around consent even so smooth and seamless, that there's not even a need for people, individuals, to constantly go back and consent to a given kind of request? What are your thoughts around that?
Well, so the discussions around ongoing consent is once the individual has a greater ability to control their province, the ownership thereof, meaning they have a greater agency in participating in the conversation, so that it's not just a one-way conversation, that it's a two-way conversation, that companies will implement consent processes that allow you to consent once, but then also allow you to, as CERT has shown in some of parts of his demo, the ability to pause consent, the ability to stop consent, the ability to revoke consent. And then, of course, there's the favorite, I want to exercise my right to erasure, right? Because there really is no such thing as a right to be forgotten. There are legal aspects in all of our lives that some things cannot be erased, like criminal convictions and defaults on loans and things of that nature. So there are a variety of companies that are working on that. DigiMe, as an example, is probably at the forefront in the way their consent management and their consent access, which they call private sharing, actually works, so that the individual at any time can click on a button and go and see everything that they've consented to, captured in one spot, and then click on them and understand what it is that they actually consented to, and take action against it if they if they so choose. Just as in the Datafund demo that we saw, your ability to go back to a historical container of consent and be able to take action on it, I think will ease some of the obstacles in and around consent. I think the other thing that's important to remember also is that, consent really got hijacked on May 25th of 2018 because every website in the world needed a consent to cookies. And so suddenly consent took on this cookie kind of thing that, the reality is consenting to a cookie, whether you consent to it or not, whether you can adjust the cookie to save information or not, it's not necessarily the same as an app where you're sharing data potentially on an ongoing basis, and the kind of permissions that you provide in that consent of what you will or will not share with an individual. Does that make sense?
Yes, definitely, and thanks for making that point clear. Gert, do you have anything to add to Jim?
I wanted to thank Kantara for the work that they did. They're doing on the standards. It's making our life much easier, not focusing on that part. And so if everyone adopts this standard, so it's easy to build a privacy control panel, even if not all the consents are in decentralized storage, which I think is best, but perhaps at some other location, there could be a privacy control panel connecting all this. But of course, this privacy control panel should have a lot of intelligence incorporated into it, because as we said, there will be a lot of consents. And I don't know how much it will be legally possible, but it would probably be, at least practically, best if this control panel would have the sort of intelligence that would act on the individual's behalf in accepting or declining consents and warning him about perhaps questionable companies asking for his consent and things like that, So this should probably, it probably will be automated in the future.
And I think you were pointing also to an interesting point, even like with during your presentation about the kind of management of the private keys, is that who holds the responsibility and kind of figuring these things out. So like who stays responsible for consenting to a given kind of request, as well as management of that. And as you mentioned, there will be companies, there are already companies that are developing their services to help with that, but the kind of relationship and who stays accountable and responsible in the end is of course also very important to figure out. Is there any questions or comments at this point that has raised up?
I have a question, Silly.
Mm-hmm.
Hello, everyone. So I would like to thank both presenters for this really interesting presentation. I think that definitely consent is a very important issue. It's like the first step of the power asymmetry between individuals and companies, and we definitely need to figure out solutions. My question is really on a general perspective of consent and the fact that we as individuals and humans are going to live in a more and more connected IoT environment. I think during the presentation, I don't really remember the presenter, but he was saying like the foresights are saying that in 10 years, we will have like 4,000 interaction in a day with different IoT tools. So I am wondering actually, what does it mean consent in such an environment when we are actually constantly interacting with IoTs, with tools and apps that are collecting our data? How are we going to manage all this in a day? It seems like a huge. So I really wonder what will be the meaning of consent in such an environment?
So it's Colin here, Colin Wallace from Kantara. I'm so sorry that I'm late. I had other calls, so I've just got off those to be here. So to just thank the Kantara reps, Chert from Datafund and Jim, Pasquale, thank you so much. And I'm looking for everyone else. So sorry to miss the presentation, but I just to try and start answering that question. You're absolutely right. There are going to be multiple IoT devices seeking some sort of consent on a kind of even if it's going through to some sort of automated agent. And it's a point that's actually been raised several times just in the last month. It's interesting that you could spend years, as we have, working on this, and it's been a human thing, primarily, derived for human things, and then right at the, there comes a tipping point when everyone is asking the same thing, and it was seemingly every month we have someone asking, so how is, what's the plans for Kantara to expand or develop consent receipt into an IoT context where, it's, there may be some sort of automation, and in some sort of very lightweight protocol that basically sends something, whether that's, NFC or Bluetooth Low Energy, or, it's some sort of way of doing that. And I think we haven't really had enough time to work out where we go forwards with it. We certainly understand there's a demand, just like there was a demand for the human thing. And often, our question, our answer back to these people who ask it is, great. It's a great question. Would you like to come and fund it? In which case they often go quiet. It's a fair question. And I'm sure that Chert will have, because I think you may be partly working on this, and other people may be also have an answer. But I just wanted to give you a brief overview from a Kantara perspective. Thanks.
Chert, would you like to add something, Colin?
Well, as I said, I think it would have to be automated, and different, as Colin mentioned, it will not only be consents as are today. There will be all sorts of IoT devices asking for consent, and I guess if Kantara figures something out, it would be great. But yeah, this is something we will be working on in the future, but we're not yet there. How to make all this possible to handle in a day's time, all these consents.
Anything to add from Jim?
So, well, what I wanted to add to that, and if you notice, I just put something in the chat that occurred here today in the United States. But I see a future where, and for a lack of better term, I see individual geofencing around IoT devices, where none of the information is shared at any given point in time until the individual has the opportunity to consume and understand exactly what's happening with that data. So whether it's better terms or better notification, I think there will be a tipping point in the IoT industry where more things like what happened to the Amazon Ring camera to this young girl in the state of Texas here in the United States in her bedroom, where a hacker pretended to be Santa, because the hacker started talking through the camera to this young person, that there'll be a point where all of the data gets locked down through some geofencing, that no one will be able to infiltrate, say, an individual's castle, their home, their privacy. What happened today is a clear infringement on an individual's privacy. And here, much like I'm sure in other countries, we're going to see stronger privacy laws, rules, and regulations surface, much like our Fourth Amendment here, which is basically a right that the government won't be creepy about you or allow creepy things to happen to you without your notice, or without you knowing about it in some way, shape, or form.
Thank you, Jim.
I also see Chris is asking some questions around a consent record and the consent receipt. Chris, I'm not familiar with the consent record architecture framework document, but I would suspect from your question that the consent record is a computation of a group of consent receipts that have been placed in an area where, instead of having to go to every requesting party separately, in other words, as individual receipts, that all of those receipts are in one record.
Yeah, I think you're right. So it seems like a consent receipt is more similar to a consent status record, maybe, which I just posted in the chat again. So my understanding is that so a consent receipt would be generated every time there is a change in the status of the consent. And so I think that would be similar to a consent status record. And then the, I guess, the collection of these consent status records would form the consent record. So,
and Colin's here, and I put the definition out of Kantara's consent receipt specification to try and help you navigate that. And I'll actually, while you read that and see if this is working for you, I'm not, so I don't know, you're best place to judge whether it's a status record or a consent record, the equivalent, you know, the equivalent definition. I mean, a comment then actually, you know, I mean, this predates the MyData architecture. So one would have hoped that in the creation of that and the creation of definitions, you didn't curate definitions straight out of nothing, but you created them after and by looking or referencing existing definitions that were available. I would like to hope anyway. But anyway, that's what Kantara's consent receipt definition is, and it comes from this document, which I'll give you a link to right now.
Cool. Yeah. Thank you so much. Actually, I didn't create the architecture frameworks.
I would welcome you to also continue this discussion over Slack, post the different definitions, and also we could ask the people who were working on the MyData architecture paper as well. So to continue the discussion after this webinar for sure. As we're a bit over time already, I would close this webinar now, continue this over Slack and over the emails that have been shared today. It has been really fascinating, the whole the webinar, and in a way there's even a feeling that we're just scraping the surface, and it's really important to continue even more with really dive deep with the different questions.
Yep.
So I would thank you both, Jim and Gert, for your presentations. We will share the slides as well as the recording of this webinar in the MyData website, as well as in our YouTube channel, and continue with the next webinars next year in January, in February, and so forth. I already mentioned, let's continue this discussion in the different channels that we have to use, and I wish you a very good Friday. If you have the chance, please join us also in the weekly celebration call in the general channel in Slack to hear what people have been working for MyData, what they've learned, and who to thank. So welcome, and if not, then have a great weekend and upcoming holidays. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, much appreciated.
Thank you. Bye.
Kantara's founding member of MyData fully supports what it does, and look forward to even more collaboration. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.